Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Carol Lee Makes Cards. Today's cards features Simon Says Stamps, Everything Together. This series of 5 cards features big, bold sentiments on alcohol ink backgrounds. I began by doing all the messy but fun stuff all at once. All of my alcohol ink work in this series is done on Canon's glossy photograph paper. I chose to work on this for a couple of reasons. At times, as in this card, I like to use my heat gun to move the ink around. The second reason is I knew I wanted to heat emboss the sentiments. I'm not sure if all photograph paper is created equally. I just happen to use the Canon. I find that the ink moves around well, and it certainly can withstand the heat. All of the alcohol inks that I'm using are by Ranger. In this first background, I'm using a combination of Willow, Dandelion, and Sunset Orange. I drop the ink directly onto the card, and then I use an eyedropper and rubbing alcohol so that the ink will move around more fluidly. For this background, I am using primarily an alcohol pearl ink called Intrigue. I do use a little bit of mixative ink called Pearl. I wanted to create a gradient from the center to the outside edges. To achieve this, I concentrate the pink to the center of the panel. I use less rubbing alcohol so that the ink does not move to the outer edges. I finish up with a little bit of the pearl mixative to break up that strong pink in the center and soften it. For the next panel, I wanted to create something that was rich and dark. For this background, I used Latte, Espresso, and Willow. I used a lot of rubbing alcohol initially to build up my background. As I layered on more and more ink, I used less rubbing alcohol. In the end, I'm not exactly sure how I feel about this one. For this background, I use a combination of citrus and dandelion. As I layered the ink on, I used less rubbing alcohol at the top of the card. The effect that I was going for were concentrated cells at the top of the card and gradually getting bigger towards the bottom. I think that I mostly achieved this. With alcohol ink, you never have full control over what is going to happen. For my final background, I used just one color, Aqua. Just one color, but so much color variation. I had mostly finished the blue card so that I could see the steps that I was going to take for the rest, and now I was ready to lay out the plan for each of the other cards. Before embossing, I die cut each of the panels using various frame dies. From Simon Says Stamp thin circle frames, A2 thin frames, and frames. For the dark panel, the outside frame was replaced with a gold matte one. The large sentiment was embossed with gold embossing powder 2 times. The pink panel was die cut with thin circle frames. I used a gel pen to make a small mark at the top of the panel and on the misty pad so that I could reposition it for embossing a second time. I should have done the embossing prior to the die cutting, especially for this circle panel. So you just problem solve as you go along. For the yellow, blue, and orange panels, I was planning on incorporating some die-cut flowers. I made sure that I used the die to help me position the sentiment. The sentiments for these 3 panels were embossed twice with white embossing powder. All 3 of these panels were die cut with various sizes from the A2 thin frames nesting dies. The frames from these 3 panels and the pink panel were replaced with white frames. Before putting the cards together, I finished up all the die cutting. The flowers that I would be using were die cut in both white cardstock and foam was die cut for all the inner panels. For the pink card, I used a sentiment strip to go with the main sentiment. This sentiment was from Simon Says Stamps' Say It All Friend. It was stamped with VersaFine ink on white cardstock, and it was die cut using Simon Says Stamps sentiment labels. The sentiment strip was mounted on white sheet foam. All the cards were put together in the same way. The thin frames were taped to the outer panel and then adhered to the card base. The inner smaller panels were adhered to the sheet foam and then attached to the card. After the foam-backed floral die cuts were adhered to the cards, then I started adding some sequin embellishments. I used iridescent confetti for all of the cards except the dark one. I liked the way this embellishment picked up the background color of the panel they were adhered to. For the dark panel, I chose matte gold sequins. The clear drying Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew was placed in the center of the depression of each sequin. And that completes this series of 5 cards where the sentiment is the focal point. Simon Says Stamps' Everything Together was the perfect choice for this set of cards with its big and bold sentiments. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to visit.